Hello and a warm welcome to the 2021 Center for Humanitarian Leadership Conference. I wish to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional owners of the land from which I am streaming live today. We pay our respects to the local people for allowing us to hold this gathering on their land and to their elders past and present. I welcome and pay respect to Indigenous people who are joining us today from Australia and around the world. Planning for this event began more than 2 years ago, but of course, no one could have predicted how much the world would change. We have been separated, isolated, challenged, and many of us have suffered. Never before has our collective conscience been so aware of division, of the dramatic inequalities that exist in our world. COVID-19 and the global Black Lives Matter movement have forced a reevaluation of institutions, power structures, and privilege. But a groundswell is gaining momentum. There is a reckoning coming, and humanitarian and development agencies and institutions are not exempt. This event welcomes more than 1,300 people from 87 countries to an intentional space. This time is sacred. In an age of Zoom, where the very word has now become a noun, a verb, and a place, we also refer to it as being zoomed out. Not here, not today. I invite you to engage with your whole heart and your whole mind, with curiosity, willingness, and yes, vulnerability. At CHL, we embrace a few core values, and today I'd like to talk about my two favorites, courage and humility. Courage means that we bravely reflect on the past and the present. You'll hear speakers present evidence of things that are really working, but you'll also be deeply challenged to face power imbalances and how the very humanitarian system that is supposed to eliminate injustice and inequality often serves to create and perpetuate broken systems. Humility means that we leave our egos outside. We ask questions and we choose curiosity. We embrace awkward conversations with purpose. Your voice is welcome here. Your presence is needed at this virtual table. Engage, be curious, and listen. If you're active on social media, please help us amplify the conversation by using hashtag 2021 HLC, Humanitarian Leadership Conference, and hashtag Who Are the Humanitarians. I'd like to now pass the floor to Aunty Georgina Nicholson, an elder from the Wurundjeri people for the Acknowledgement of Country.
Hello, everyone. My name is Georgina Nicholson, and I am a proud Wurundjeri Wurrung woman. Wurundjeri being part of the Kulin Nation. The Kulin Nation consists of 5 clans, and they are Wurundjeri, Boonwurrung, Wathaurong, Tanarong, and Dja Wurrung. Wurundjeri being all of Melbourne CBD and surrounding country, extending north to the Great Dividing Range, east to Mount Baw Baw, south to Mordialloc Creek, and west to the mouth of Werribee River. So I would like to acknowledge and pay my respect to our ancestors who walked and lived on this land as free spirits for millennia. Also, I would like to acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are online with us today. And I would like to pay my respect to you all and to your elders. I am pleased to be doing the welcome for this event today. I would like to acknowledge all of the dignitaries joining us today online from all over the world. This is wonderful to have this technology. For those of you tuning in from Wurundjeri country, I would like to say to you, Womanjika Wurundjeri Balak, Yemen Kundibik. So I would just like to tell you what I've said in our Wurrung language, and that is welcome to the land of the Wurundjeri people. For all of the people that are tuning in from all different lands, I would like to acknowledge all of the traditional owners on the land you are on today and pay my respect to you all and to your elders. So As we navigate through the COVID-19 pandemic, I reflect on the legacy of those who have come before me. I reflect on the long, strong, unbroken line of Aboriginal women that I come from. I think about the challenges they would have faced, and I draw strength from them. So my mother, Martha Margaret Nicholson, nee Terrick, was delivered by her grandmother, Granny Jemima, and that was on Corrandirk Aboriginal Mission near the present-day town of Healesville. So Granny Jemima was already teaching our mother the importance of caring for country, culture and family. Years later, our mother met a deadly means great, wonderful, a deadly Irish man called Patrick, and they met on a blind date in the early 1930s. In 1937, Mummy and Daddy were married, and back then it was in a registry office, and they had 16 children. So I'm the youngest of the 16, and my oldest sister is the oldest, Pat Ockwell. She's an amazing senior elder who has made a lifelong commitment to her people. She turned 83 last year, and for an Aboriginal woman to reach that age is a milestone, for they say our life expectancy gap is about 12 to 15 years there, where we don't live as long as other cultures. So that's a huge gap for our people. So we do have a lot of sorry business going on. And all those babies are single babies, no twins, all single babies. So no cheating, LOL. So, you know, we must carry on the culture for our people as our ancestors did, and my mother and her mother and so on have done for us. My mother was a very strong cultural woman who instilled great values in me. William Barrack, perhaps the people in Melbourne would know more of William Barrack. His younger sister, Annie Barrack, that is my direct bloodline. So one tradition being our Wurundjeri language is part of our deep, rich heritage. Our language has been sleeping, and now I like to say we are waking it up. Some of the ways we keep it alive is through stories, song and performances. So the coronavirus pandemic changed the world in ways we would never have imagined, and the implications for our community have been profound for our health, our well-being and our jobs. In many ways, this event online today and all the other events I've done online are just so important. They are what we do without them, without this online. I mean, this is just wonderful. So I've learnt a lot about this now, doing this online, but it brings into focus, you know, the relationships between people, between community, between people, and between our families. So I didn't realise how important connection is with people until this all happened. Like, I think as people we do crave and we do need, connection. It's very important. I just didn't realise how important it was till this all happened. But it has been very mentally challenging for people, and so we're getting through it. Aboriginal culture is the oldest living continuing culture there is. It dates back to 80,000 years plus. So Aboriginal people, we do know about resilience and solidarity and connection to land, which is an important one. We are the sovereign owners of Australia, and there have been no treaties with us up to date, and we have never ceded our sovereignty. So that's pretty sad. But Wurundjeri people would like you to ask you, that people that are on land, to respect the land, the waters, the flora and fauna, and respect each other. Thank you for having me again today. I hope you have a great day. Please take care, everyone, wherever you may be. Take care, stay COVID safe, and thank you.
Thank you, Aunty Georgina, for your time and your presence here. We really appreciate that you are telling us these wonderful stories about your family and reminding us about the connection to place and to land. As we host this conference or this gathering, We really want you to be engaged in our virtual gathering in a way that might still be very unfamiliar despite more than 12 months of almost nothing but online gathering. Imagine for a moment that we were able to host this conference in person, that we were able to meet in real life, grab a cup of coffee and mingle with us. Let's reimagine our gatherings in this COVID reality. We're going to practice using your platform a bit today. I know this is a new platform for most people. We're going to start with the Ask a Question box. I'd like you to think for a moment, following on Aunty Georgina's reminder of the importance of country and place and connection. I'd like you to drop a note in the Ask a Question box. I see some of you have been using the chat feature, so it's great you found that. Drop a note telling us the country from which you identify, where are you from, or from where are you joining. If you are a member of an Indigenous group, please feel free to acknowledge your country and your people. You are welcome here. For example, I come from Kentucky and Arizona, USA, but sometimes I feel closer to places like Syria, Turkey, or Australia. I hold many identities as part of my whole person, and I invite you to drop a word or words that describe the place of your identity. We are all welcome here. Our next speaker hardly requires an introduction. Most people at this conference know this person. She also spoke at CHL's last conference 2 years ago. She is someone who, for me, emulates the values of courage and humility like few people that I've ever met. Degan Ali is the executive director of Adeso and has more than 20 years of hands-on experience in the humanitarian and development field. Degan is a strong believer in transforming the current aid system to give more power and voice to local communities and civil society organizations. Following this belief, she continues to innovate and develop new solutions to build the infrastructures that will truly shift power and resources, including co-founding the very important Network for Empowered Aid Response, or the NEAR network. Degan and I met virtually less than 1 year ago when I reached out to her with courage and humility to ask if she would co-convene this gathering with me. Thankfully, she agreed, and we started a true partnership to co-develop and co-lead this endeavor. Thank you, Degan, for your leadership in this space. You have inspired me countless times, and thank you for jumping in with me on this big adventure. Please welcome Degan Ali.
Thank you, Mariana. It's such a privilege to be here. Thank you for to the CHL team for organizing such an amazing event, particularly Mariana and Liz. Adeso is very honored to have been given the opportunity to co-organize this important event. I'm personally very grateful to Mariana, who approached me a year ago, as she mentioned, when we didn't even know each other. And she just contacted me and said, would you be willing to help me organize this event? And at that time, my first request was that this conference does not become another talk shop like the hundreds of humanitarian events that I have been to, hundreds. So we do a lot of talking in this sector, but no real action. Let's just reflect on the World Humanitarian Summit, which I personally invested huge amounts of effort and time into. There were 2 years of consultations all across the world. Thousands and thousands of human hours were involved in working on the event in the background. Those of us who engaged in the process from the Global South also spent thousands of human hours on it. Millions of dollars were spent in flying us all over the world and in nice hotels. But now reflecting back on it 5 years later, what major substantive transformative things have we achieved? I'm sorry to say, but very little, if any. And that's really quite disappointing. So this conference has been designed to be the first of its kind. I have personally never participated or spoken at a large humanitarian conference where we truly come together as a sector to address the elephant in the room, which is power, race, and colonialism. We have talked about localization ad nauseum, mostly through technocratic lens. However, localization does not cut it for us. It is a term that's loaded with all the wrong things that we want to dismantle. Our communities and countries don't need to be localized. We don't need the global North people to do something to us or for us. We need global North organizations to recognize their purposeful neo-colonial role in perpetuating an aid system that is all about continuing the power dynamics that continue to keep us in poverty and in a position of need. We demand that you take stock and accountability of your complicity in the economic, financial, and trade mechanisms that continue the invisible chains of colonialism in our countries. Your aid programs are not lifting our people and our countries out of poverty, but rather ensuring that policies around trade and food subsidies continue their insidious and chronic destruction. You all come in to supposedly fix the conditions caused by a drought or a famine that is wholly man-made from economic and trade policies that failed us. So here are some 4 recommendations for the sector that are both personal and political. Number 1, you need to do the hard work as white and Black and brown people on recognizing our role in perpetuating the above and how we have benefited from it. Most white people in the sector are good people with good intentions. Some have done the hard work of recognizing their privilege and how they have benefited. Some continue to think that their good intentions are enough and have not spent the time required for deep personal reflection. Some, a small minority, I would like to say, simply are a lost cause and need to leave the sector altogether. This past year, I have been surprised by the number of white people, mostly women, who have said that as white people, they should exit their senior roles and leave it to a person of color. While some of my Global South colleagues or people of color may disagree with me, I am not a proponent of getting only people of color in all decision-making positions. Yes, we need more diversity and power to be devolved to, especially to staff working in country with communities. But we also need white allies and solidarity. Having all white people exit the sector, especially those who have done the hard journey of personal and deep reflection, is not in our benefit. As Black and brown people, we also need to own our own elite status in our countries and how we continue to play this game, because we want more money, we want more funding. We need to have the courage to walk away from money and not let it be the driving force of our decisions. We need to refashion our organizations so that they're not solely dependent on the whims and changes of our INGO and UN partners. We need to create resilient and nimble organizations that do not follow the business model of INGOs and UN that say success is to be measured by how large your organization's income is. We need to develop our own metrics of success that is rooted in truly advocating for the best interest of our communities. Number 2, we need true global civil society solidarity that involves both Global South and North institutions to advocate for changes in our global governance institutions, specifically the Bretton Woods institutions. We cannot simply say that such reforms are too impossible. Would we have been able to predict in 2018 or even 2019 the kind of changes and reforms that 2020 and 2021 have brought us? I certainly could not have never have predicted the impact that the death of George Floyd and COVID-19 were going to have in reshaping US institutions and globally getting us to the level where we are having this important discourse. We are at a watershed moment right now, and the decisions we make in the next 3 to 6 months will have major ramifications on our respective organizations and the entire sector. We do not need aid. We need fair and just economic, financial, and trade policies to lift our people out of poverty. That should be the driving force behind our work for the next 20 years. Number 3, we need to redesign our humanitarian decision-making forums, such as the IAC, the Grand Bargain clusters, and so on. All of these fora are dominated by the Global North and designed solely for the purpose of serving the interest of the UN, INGOs, and donors. None of these forums reflect any effort to share power and include Global South institutions, including and especially the national governments. Number 4, Let's put a stop to using harmful terminology and narrative like localization and embrace more appropriate lexicon like decolonization. Let's stop having DEI and localization strategies, but rather strategies to decolonize our institutions and the aid architecture. So I would like to end by saying, let's use this conference to reflect on what role we can play in ensuring that these recommendations and more are achieved. This list is not exhaustive. Let us not walk away from this conference ready for more talk, but rather we need to walk away with personal commitments for more action. In this sector, we are very good at pontificating and talking, but we're very bad at making change happen. I hope that this conference will inspire and motivate us to finally make the long-awaited and very important change that is needed, that is long-awaited, that is extremely delayed, finally happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Degan. As always, you've gotten us off to a cracking start with a challenge to move from rhetoric to action. And as Degan pointed out, we really want this conference, this gathering, to be the first of its kind, where we really move away from just talking and we really engage wholeheartedly with this topic. I don't think anyone coming to this event today would be here if we didn't recognize that we were long on problems and short on solutions. So thank you, Degan, for that. While I introduce our next speaker, I'll invite you again to engage with us on the platform by using the chat box on the right side of the screen. And if you look at your screen, there's a chat box, which I can see that some of you have been using. Below that, there's a purple button that says Ask a Question. You can drop a question at any time for any of the speakers on this plenary session. We will be having, at the end of the session, we'll have a short time to have a panel discussion. And so your questions that come through will be really helpful if you have questions for specific speakers. I'm sure plenty of you have questions regarding Degan's last comments. The other thing I'd like to do is I'd like to invite you again to make this a virtual gathering space that we can all gain something from. I'd like to ask you to type a one-word answer in the chat that reflects your mood or your vibe when you think about today and tomorrow as we gather together. For example, I might type the word centered if I'm feeling centered now. But if I'm being really honest, I might also say terrified because I know that there could be 1,000 people on this call. The difference between the function ask a question and the chat function is that your questions can be edited or deleted if you don't like the way it came across, but your chat cannot. Your chat is there. It also has emoji features, which I know that we all love. But the question, there are these two functions there, so feel free to use either of those as we go along. So what I'd like you to do now is to go ahead and drop a 1 or 2 word comment about how you're feeling. And then we'll be able to, there's someone in the background moderating the questions, and we'll be able to get those questions up to the speakers toward the end of the time here. I'd like to briefly take a moment to highlight a few really special features of this conference. We have really tried to pull together something that is a bit different. When we first began talking about this conference as a team, we wanted this event to be something very different. This was really at the beginning of the new online COVID world, but even at the beginning of that really difficult time, we knew that this event had the potential to be something really amazing. One of the features you don't want to miss that will be incorporated throughout, we have invited Dana Dejani, who will be composing live pop-up poetry throughout the conference. So keep an eye out. She'll be dropping in and out of different sessions with a surprise pop-up poetry moment. On day 2, we have a really special treat as well. We have a musician named Sean Ryan, who has recorded a live didgeridoo performance that was crafted in the Blue Mountains in honor of this conference so that we can enjoy a little break tomorrow from all of the talking and the vulnerability and the courageous questions that we have. So I hope you do take time to see that. We also have a fabulous workshop by Nikita Shah, who will be developing a poetry workshop that is definitely on my list of things to check out. Center for Humanitarian Leadership exists as a strategic impact center within Deakin's Faculty of Arts and Education. This allows us to harness the academic power of a leading university while also keeping one foot in the humanitarian practitioner space. CHL would not be possible without strong support from Deakin University since 2011. We are so grateful for Deakin's ongoing support and hosting the Center for Humanitarian Leadership. Therefore, it's truly an honor for me to welcome our next speaker. Professor Iain Martin is Deakin's Principal Executive Officer. He leads the university and determines its academic and strategic vision. The Vice-Chancellor also plays a role in major cultivation and sustaining of Deakin University's relationships with its many key external stakeholders. Professor Iain Martin has been Vice-Chancellor at Deakin University since July 2019. Prior to taking up his appointment as Vice-Chancellor of Deakin University, Professor Martin was the Vice-Chancellor of Anglia Ruskin University. He, I've been told, was born in South Wales and spent his childhood in Hampshire. He also is an interesting one because he started his training and worked as a surgeon in Leeds before moving to New Zealand in the year 2000. Please join me in welcoming Professor Iain Martin for the special official opening of our conference today.
Thank you very much indeed. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you today and to launch what I'm sure is going to be an absorbing, thought-provoking conference. The Centre for Humanitarian Leadership is truly a joint collaboration between Deakin and Save the Children Australia, who are proud co-producers, co-organisers of this wonderful event. Many, if not all, of the issues being discussed over the next 2 days are complex and vexed. There are no simple answers. There are few, if any, moral certitudes. The perspectives you will hear and the conversations you'll participate in are not possible without formats like this that allow time for much deeper examination and the free contest of ideas. During the conference, you're going to challenge the traditional place and value attached to humanitarian systems, actors, and perceptions. You're going to focus on who are the real humanitarians and thus challenge existing practices and historical understandings. As overdue as this is, it's certainly not going to be easy. It will not be easy to balance what we must learn from the past, despite its shortcomings, with what we must forge anew. And in this context, I'm going to reflect on Deakin University and the legacy of Alfred Deakin to illustrate both our own thinking and also suggest how we might consider a wider approach. We certainly must not shy away from these conversations just because they're demanding or uncomfortable. On the contrary, we must engage with people who have knowledge, we must listen to others' lived experiences, and we must better try to understand and learn from the past. I look forward to having these conversations with you. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. So famously wrote the British novelist L.P. Hartley in the opening line of his 1953 novel, The Go-Between. In that first chapter, his narrator, Leo Colston, is in the attic of his childhood home, looking at trinkets from his youth. These long-lost items are bringing up uncomfortable memories he had suppressed. One in particular evokes unwelcome feelings, a diary he'd written about his experiences as a child. He says of the diary, "I did not want to touch it and told myself that this was because it challenged my memory. I was proud of my memory and disliked having it prompted." The past can be confronting, or indeed, through the rose-tinted lens of nostalgia, it can be comforting, even a motivating force for recreating a lost world. We've all seen to that effect too, make something great again. Over the last few decades, we've had to confront some untold truths about our past, especially things that took place under the cover of the once immutable institutions that governed our society. More recently, there's been another series of flashpoints, including the Black Lives Matter protests and the Me Too movement. In Australia, more specifically, royal commissions have uncovered the truth across a range of serious social issues and failings. And indeed, even within the humanitarian sector, sexual abuse and harassment by aid workers of vulnerable community members has been a point of controversy and focus. There is no doubt our collective past is coming under greater and greater scrutiny. These moments prompt us to pause and re-examine the people and the institutions we've relied on and perhaps taken for granted. We also start to question those who we venerate through our organisations, our statues and monuments, the awarding of honours, right down to the language we use and the inherent bias it betrays. We're having to look at the framework behind the walls and the foundations beneath the floor. This is an uncomfortable process, often even painful. To many, it feels like an upheaval, a tearing down of the structures that support our society, however flawed they might be. But to many others, it feels long overdue, a process of truth-telling and of setting things right. As we learn new perspectives of our history, a strong temptation is to judge the past solely on our present values. One of the greatest challenges is being sympathetic to the context of the time, to understand, just like today, issues were complex and contextual. In particular, it's very difficult to neatly separate the social and political structures of the past from the people who lived among them, the challenges they faced, the privileges they enjoyed, the views they held, and the reasoning that underpinned them. Let me reflect on Australia's two very different origin stories as an entry point to the discussions that will take place during this conference. These two stories converged in the late 18th century, and even now, 233 years later, our country is still trying to reconcile what came of this. The aftermath of two cultures colliding. The healing process of reconciliation continues today, and in some years we make better progress than in others. There is no simple solution. Compassion takes time to take effect. But reconciliation is not about throwing away one part of our history. Both origin stories have their place. It should, and indeed must, be about acknowledging, reflecting, and moving forward together. A genuine reconciliation, from the Latin conciliare, to bring together. The Yolngu word, makarata, also describes the process of conflict resolution, peacemaking, and justice, and is used in the profound and extremely moving Uluru Statement from the Heart. It reads, Makarata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. What a truly poetic meaning that expresses the initial pain, shared empathy, and forgiveness that needs to follow. At Deakin, we've recently reaffirmed our commitment to the Indigenous people of this country. In our new 10-year strategic plan, Deakin 2030 Ideas to Impact, we have committed to reconciliation and treaty, to advance the educational aspirations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and to help move Indigenous knowledges into the mainstream of Australian life. All our endeavours aim to reflect on Australia's full history and seek to build an inclusive future. However, just like many other institutions, just as in the humanitarian sector, we must also acknowledge our past if we're to grow and move forward together. Universities form a significant part of the social structure of our past and present. As places of knowledge and learning, they've played and continue to play an influential role in defining the prominent thinking of the day. Given this, what is the role of universities in humanitarian leadership now? And in order to be seen as leaders, how do we address the challenges of our own histories, their inconsistencies, and indeed perhaps hypocrisies? As a modern, globally connected university, we at Deakin see our fundamental role as delivering outcomes that benefit society, locally, nationally, and globally. Our efforts across the university aim to achieve this or to support this endeavour. We will work with others, collaborate, seek strong partnerships, and seek those that will endure. But historically, universities have not always been community-facing and open to society at large. In fact, they came under regular criticism for being cloistered, shut off from the world. The first universities created in Europe by Christian monks, with the University of Bologna founded in 1088. Since that time, reflecting wider shifts in political, economic, and intellectual realities, universities across the globe have become more secular. And indeed, Australia's university is absolutely in this mould. In Australia, in 1850, the University of Sydney was established, adopting the principle of institutional autonomy, offering entry without religious qualification. That would become the model for almost all Australian higher education, an autonomous, professional, comprehensive, secular, public, and indeed community university. But as each new Australian university was established, their links to the predominant Commonwealth history and culture remained strong. We can still see this clearly in the names of many formed in the second half of the 20th century. Monash University, 1958, La Trobe, 1964, Curtin and Flinders, 1966, James Cook, 1970, and yes, Deakin University, formed in 1974 and named after Alfred Deakin, Australia's second Prime Minister and one of the primary architects of federation. From these foundations, from these Anglo-centric cultural origins, how can we create a better and stronger blend of worldviews and cultural knowledge? And indeed, what is in a name? Does a name and its connotations and its history define an institution? At the request of senior Indigenous leaders and members of the Deakin families, we've begun the conversation about the origin and symbolism of our university's name. As the saying goes, organisations evolve in the direction of the questions they ask. We're extremely grateful to be able to ask these important questions and discuss them respectfully. I'm aware that so many of you are joining me from around the world, but I think a little bit of a background to Alfred Deakin is important. Alfred Deakin was a complex character, a man of many parts. He was absolutely a product of his time, but he also projected himself into the future. He was a teetotaler, didn't smoke, and in his youth was a strict vegetarian. He was drawn to spiritualism and mysticism, but also based much of his worldview on Christianity. He was politically astute, especially in the art of compromise, but also plagued by self-doubt throughout his career, despite overt and open confidence and his impressive skills in oratory. Like his persona, his record of political achievements is multifaceted. Some elements almost contradictory, or at least not stereotypical for a conservative politician of that era. Through advocacy and the introduction of legislation, he championed workers' rights and conditions in factories and pioneered better irrigation practices to improve agriculture and stimulate economic growth. While a product of the British colonies and loyal to the empire, he was an Australian foremost, and his passion was the movement for federation. However, and without doubt, there are other activities and views he espoused in the political arena that, without doubt in today's context, are problematic and troubling. In particular, his views on nationalism, white Australia, and race relations more broadly. However, we have to be careful to avoid seeing these aspects in isolation and to judge accordingly. As Alfred Deakin himself said, "We are what others have made us. Individuality is a cautious compound of other lives." And as John Lanoisi observed in his biography of Deakin, of all men yet concerned in Australian politics, he is the last who should rest neatly labelled in a historical pigeonhole. Alongside this, and importantly, we must acknowledge that there is an Alfred Deakin legacy and a Deakin University legacy. The two, while linked, have their own identities, their own achievements, and the university continues to forge its own reputation. We believe, and a view shared by many of our local Indigenous leaders, is the best legacy for Alfred Deakin is Deakin University bringing Indigenous and colonial history together to forge something uniquely and distinctly Australia. Bringing together expertise in a distinctive cultural setting and finding ways to unite people from different cultures and experiences. The fusion of many cultures and ideas is stronger than any one on its own. The 8 portables on the edge of a campus in 1986 became the Institute of Koori Education and today Ngakiri, and the more than 1,000 Indigenous students from communities across the nation who graduated since are a key and pivotal part of the legacy of Deakin University. There is no one right approach or response to reconciliation. It is a coming together of cultures over time. Acknowledgement of the past comes first, then we work to create a harmony of voices and ethos and a shared vision for the future. Yeah, language is absolutely powerful, and we choose to name things for the symbolism and evocation it evokes. But as we find out more about our past, we must acknowledge both the good and the bad. But rather than discard all of one culture's language and memory, we must work even harder to achieve a better blend of Indigenous and other names and symbols. While our universities are steeped in European history, What we haven't got, we don't have, is the equivalent from Indigenous history, a real gap. We took the British model, and not known or acknowledged at the time was there's more than 60,000 years of rich culture that surrounded us. To quote Professor Grace Karskens from the University of New South Wales, describing Sydney, but applicable to so many of the landscapes in this wonderful land, these are story lands, replete with meanings so dense, so rich, so poignant, so ancient, so modern, and yet so often invisible. It is our duty to continue to uncover these stories, to learn from them and reconcile the essence of Makarrata. In our own strategic plan, through our own commitments, we've acknowledged this as a central theme. It's part of our university, Deakin's commitment to a shared future. The road extending behind us and ahead of us is absolutely not clear of obstacles and debris, nor is it free of traps and snares, many of which of our own making. We must take the best of the past with us and acknowledge and learn from the worst. And what about the rest of that foreign country of the past that we are yet to discover and to judge? We know that for many Indigenous people, the present, not the past, is a foreign country, so we certainly have a long way to go. Stan Grant, a Wurundjeri man and one of our country's greatest minds, said, "Whenever our history looms over the present, obscuring progress, the past frames the present and denies the future. We must not let our past cast such a shadow over our future, but we must have these important conversations. We have to continue to learn and travel forward together." To borrow the thoughts of another British author, although in this case, one like me who went out to the so-called colonies and became an Australian, Alex Miller, the story of our journey is always a fiction. It's always dealing with the past on the present's terms. We tell the story in order to free ourselves from the past so that we can move on, not in order to recover the past, which is merely nostalgia. Traveling, moving on, seeking the future is what we do. Thank you so much for allowing me to be part of today's conference.
Thank you, Iain, for this honest and compelling reflection to open our conference officially. This is the kind of honest reflection that we're really craving for the next 2 days. So thank you for setting the stage with this very courageous reflection on the past and how we unite that with our present. We will look forward to hearing more of these ideas during the Q&A later. Just a reminder for people, if you'd like to ask questions, continue dropping those into the chat or into the question box, and we'll be able to get those brains going again later. I do have one last intentional exercise to get us using our brains and practicing this idea of courage and humility. If you could please use the chat box one more time, you can see the theme. We really do want this to be an engaging event, and the event really will be what we all make of it. So please use those chat features. For those of you who are way over on the other side of the world, we recognize it's getting into the very early hours of the morning, or potentially very, very late at night. But I hope that your brains are still functional for us. If you could please type into the chat box a few words to describe what you think is the most important problem that we need to solve within the humanitarian and development system. Feel free to be brief. You don't need to find the perfect words. That is fully against the principles that we want to establish for this conference. We don't need to come with perfect words. We don't need to come with a perfect question. We just need to come bravely and courageously. So drop a few words. We're simply setting our intention together as a group so that we can wrestle with some of these big ideas over the next 2 days. I, for one, don't believe that you can start to tackle a problem until you've named it and named it clearly. So feel free to drop a few words in there. Again, don't overthink, and we will very much look forward to your responses. Our next speaker is someone that I've gotten to know a bit over the course of the last 6 to 9 months. As I mentioned earlier, I approached Degan Ali less than a year ago to see if she would co-convene this event with us. And she had a fantastic idea to start gathering together some INGO CEOs to start wrestling with some of the obstacles and difficulties that we might face as organizations try to wrestle with localization or decolonization, or other inequities that we see in the system. So I've gotten to know Danny a bit, and Dr. Danny Sriskandarajah is someone that I've grown to really respect and enjoy learning from and discussing with. He has been the Chief Executive Officer of Oxfam Great Britain since January 2019. Prior to that, he had been Secretary General to Civicus, the Global Civil Society Alliance, for 6 years. He has previously been Director General of the Royal Commonwealth Society, Interim Director of the Commonwealth Foundation, and held various posts at the Institute for Public Policy Research. Danny is a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Global Public Goods in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. From 2018 to 2019, he was a member of the UN Secretary General's High-Level Panel on Digital Cooperation, which was co-chaired by Jack Ma and Melinda Gates. And from 2015 to 2016, he was a member of the High-Level Panel on Humanitarian Finance that was organized around the time of the World Humanitarian Summit. He has been a trustee of the Bering Foundation, Comic Relief, and International Alert, and he's a member of the lead group of Scaling Up Nutrition. Please join me in welcoming Danny Sriskandarajah.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's such a privilege to be joining the Humanitarian Leadership Conference this year, even if we are doing it virtually. What an important opportunity for us to talk about the fundamental changes that are taking place around us, but also that need to take place within our sector. I'd like to begin, though, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands across Australia, but particularly where Deakin University stands, paying respects to elders past and present. And as someone who grew up in Australia in the 1980s and 90s, it's really important for me to note that Aboriginal sovereignty has never been ceded. I wanted to begin my own remarks with a quote from an amazing, inspiring Australian Aboriginal artist, academic, activist, Dr. Lilla Watson. She said, "If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. If you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. If you have come to help me, you're wasting your time. If you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." For me, that's such a powerful insight, criticism, or even roadmap for our sector. It's a criticism because many people fear that our entire sector is built on a notion of paternalism, that we are there to help others, that we have a saviour complex. And of course, there are some who go even further, that saying this system isn't even about helping people, it's about helping oneself, that the aid system more generally is there to serve the interests of the donors, the existing old power institutions, and prevents the rise of new dynamic power. I also think it's a roadmap because that notion of mutuality, of solidarity, is so important to, I suspect, all of us who are listening to this call. And to me, it provides the basis for what I think a new humanitarianism should look like for the new era that we're entering. I wanted to just begin with some reflections of after 2 years of my time at Oxfam Great Britain. This is such an amazing, wonderful organisation that's been around for almost 80 years now. For me, when I talk about a new era, it's because it feels, at least in my experience at Oxfam, that we've had two distinct phases in our 80-year history, but are on the cusp of a third distinct phase. The first phase, what began in 1942 in our case. 8 ordinary people came together in the basement of a church in Oxford and decided to do 2 things: raise money for famine relief in Nazi-occupied Greece, and 2, challenge the UK government's policy of blockading Nazi-occupied territories where famine was happening. Now, that DNA has been with us for all of our years, and I suspect that idea of providing relief but speaking truth to power as well embodies many of the institutions that today make up the humanitarian system. That founding phase and those founding principles were also important because they were based on volunteerism. Oxfam didn't have a paid member of staff for years, and almost everything was done through this spirit of solidarity, of mutuality. But then there seems to be a second phase that emerges somewhere in the 1960s. It probably begins with the formalization of the aid sector, of the creation of official development assistance, of new agencies dedicated to channeling those funds. And in the case of Oxfam, what I see is a professionalization, an institutionalization of what we stood for, so that we can deliver at speed across the world where need arises, so that we can deliver consistent quality, so that we can deliver on common principles as a sector, so that we can hold each other to account. These developments were critical in creating the humanitarian system that we know, that has these amazing principles, that these amazing institutions. And yet, it feels like, despite all of the powerful progress in those first two phases, the world is changing around us, and it's time we think about what we need for this new era. It feels like, although sadly humanitarian need continues to be all around us across the world, so much else is going against us. Public support for international development, for international assistance, is falling in many parts of the global north. Donor governments, just as they should be raising aid levels, are cutting aid. In the United Kingdom, we've had a government announce that it's going to renege on its legislated commitment to 0.7% of gross national income to aid. In Australia, for example, aid now stands at 0.21% of GNI, the lowest it's been for decades. Meanwhile, trust in charities, in non-profits, is falling in many parts of the world, as people are asking, why do we need these institutions, these intermediaries, to channel our solidarity, our compassion? People are starting to question our own inefficiencies. And further, many people are rightly asking, why is our system so dominated by northern-founded institutions, northern-funded institutions, northern-headquartered institutions? And why can't we have a more level playing field? And finally, there's of course COVID-19 and what this pandemic has meant, not just in the acute pressures it's creating in the short term, but for the opportunities it creates in the long term to do things radically differently, to make sure that we have a just recovery and an opportunity perhaps for us to think differently about what we need. In the case of Oxfam, we're thinking about and we're rolling out a series of changes in which I hope will lead to a fundamentally different looking Oxfam in this new phase of our own history. Our geography is going to change. We are going to focus more of our direct operations in a fewer fragile contexts, in a smaller number of fragile contexts, where we recognize we need direct operations so that we can ensure safe and secure delivery of our interventions, so that we can have the wherewithal we need to provide in complex, insecure environments. But elsewhere, Oxfam is going to turn up in very different ways. In many parts of the world, we'll have new affiliates, we'll have new members, standalone institutions that were already there in local civil society, joining the Oxfam network, creating new influencing and advocacy hubs that may not have the same operational footprint that Oxfam once had. And of course, a fundamental part of how we're changing is a renewed commitment to working in partnership. Oxfam already works with some 3,500 partners across the world. In our next phase, we want to be partner-led. We want to make those commitments meaningful so that we can shift power, shift resources to the very partners who we rely on to get the job done in many cases. We're also changing internally. For example, we're trying to be a far more inclusive organization that's more reflective of the communities that we work with. We're trying to change the way that we are governed so that we have a more level playing field, a more globally balanced network, rather than having power concentrated in a few northern bits of our own community. And we're trying to be a more anti-racist organization to take the decolonizing agenda head on, so that we can lead by example in creating a new type of post-colonial or post-colonial network fit for the future. But these are just things we're doing, and I think they're part of what I see as a wider challenge for all of us who think of ourselves as humanitarianism. And put simply, I think that challenge is about balancing the how with the what. For many years, for decades perhaps, we've rightly focused on the what, making sure that we deliver effectively, quickly, safely, efficiently around the world. But I think the last few years have taught us that we need to pay almost as much attention to the how, to make sure that we are creating institutions, creating an ecosystem that really is reflective of the values that we aspire to. And that humanitarianism, the new humanitarianism for this new era, needs, I think, to focus on these hows. And in particular, I want to share 3 hows, if you will, that I hope we can talk about over the next 2 days and beyond. The first is, of course, about keeping people safe. All of you will have heard or read about Oxfam's failings in Haiti a few years ago, and many of you, I suspect, have been reading about our own new allegations of misconduct in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo. A senior politician just a few days ago asked me, when they read about the allegations in the DRC, they said, Oxfam was such a wonderful organisation for decades. Why have you let sexual misconduct run rife in recent years? And a few days later, the UK government suspended any new funding for Oxfam. And much of the public discussion, and even the stakeholder discussion, I think, assumes that if cases of misconduct are still occurring, then this must be evidence that Oxfam is failing, that it isn't taking misconduct seriously. And yet, the opposite is true. As many of us will know, if we do our jobs right, we won't be hearing about fewer cases, we're likely to hear about more, at least in the medium term. And no organisation, whether it's a church, a government, a sporting club, can ever claim that it's free from the risk of abuse. And of course, as many of us will know, it's particularly the case in the context that we work in, where a little bit of power, being able to control who gets a job offer or a few dollars of cash assistance, can lead to huge opportunities for abuse of power. That doesn't make individual instances of sexual misconduct or bullying or any other form of abuse of power any less shocking. Indeed, you could argue that those of us who are claiming to be doing good have an extra responsibility to prevent harm from occurring. But I hope it does set an agenda for us all to invest in the processes, in the systems, in the cultures that reduce the risk of misconduct from happening, and at the same time invest in the systems, the processes and cultures that deal effectively with misconduct where and when it occurs. I think that's a critical lesson for us all, so that we as a sector are judged by the right metrics, by the right expectations, so that it's what happens before and after misconduct that organisations like ours or our whole sector is judged on. And of course, I hope you have seen that at Oxfam, we have learnt, perhaps the hard way, that we have to put things right, and that progress means painstaking work by our safeguarding team to support survivors, so that we investigate allegations of misconduct carefully, especially in countries where perpetrators have the right to identify and even cross-examine survivors and witnesses. And it might mean, in some cases, as we did in the DRC from last year, asking external investigators to come in and examine and investigate cases of misconduct. All of this is part of a renewed effort in our case to put things right, to make sure that we are investing in those systems. This journey has not been easy, and the recent allegations that many colleagues or former colleagues are still not happy with the way that our systems are working is perhaps the most poignant reminder of the journey that we are on. But we are on that journey, and I think that's really important, not just for Oxfam, but for the credibility of our entire sector. Indeed, for our entire sector's license to operate. A second how relates to accountability. When I was a member of the United Nations Secretary General's high-level panel on humanitarian financing, the bit of the report that I was really excited about, in some ways, was the one on accountability, on what we called the need for an accountability revolution in our sector. For me, that's going to be critical, because if we are going to fundamentally change our institutions, our infrastructure, our ecosystem, then accountability, and in particular, closing those feedback loops between the communities we work in, our own institutions, between the North and the South, between donors and the ultimate targets of those resources, is going to be critically important. And for me, our sector has such a proud record of innovating, of experimenting in this area. We really need to lean into this, that we need to show the world that we can close those feedback loops, that we can put the last first, that we can invest in misconduct reporting schemes so that we understand where and when abuse is happening, so that we can make sure that all of our staff, wherever we operate, have an equal voice in the organizations that we work in, so that we really challenge donors and others to behave better and to take their own responsibilities seriously in our ecosystem. And we need to remove the obstacles, change habits, take risks, so that we really can create a far more accountable set of institutions in our sector. And finally, a third how is around innovation or doing things differently. I mean, again, for me, our sector has been at its best when it's been at the vanguard of innovations. I've seen it. I've been inspired by the work that we do on tiger worm toilets, or on P-powered lighting systems, on cash programming, on blockchain-based programming, on 3D printing. All of these innovations I've seen are examples of how our sector, sometimes born out of necessity, is at the cutting edge of how things could work. And we almost need to get our mojo back, to have the confidence in ourselves to be able to be at the leading edge of innovation, whether that's in how things work in the humanitarian context or how things work within our own institution. A key to that, I think, is to create an enabling environment that allows us to do that. A responsibility, again, drawing on my experiences working in the high-level panel on humanitarian financing, is the particular responsibility that those who have resources, donors in particular, but also institutions like ours and the bigger INGOs have, to make sure that we are investing in those actors who are going to be at the cutting edge of doing things differently. And I think that focus on innovation is going to be key, not just to improve how we work, but to make sure that we are building that new humanitarianism for that new era, so that we are back again leading by example on the changes we want to see in the world. So those are three hows that I hope we can talk about over the next few days: keeping people safe, on taking accountability seriously, and really investing in innovation. Let me conclude by talking about what I haven't talked about. You might have noticed I haven't mentioned localization once so far in my remarks. And I've done that on purpose, because although I believe passionately in the localization agenda, I'm convinced that's just the start of our journey, not the end of our journey, that localization and resilience is not just means, but the end in itself. That ultimately what we are here to do is to build systems that support and nurture that mutual liberation that Lila Watson talks about, and not the paternalistic model of helping. And so building local capacity in itself is only a first step in a far more profound journey that will fundamentally transform our system. And we have to recognize that although we as a system, as a sector, have done some amazing, remarkable things over these last few decades, we have also built an international humanitarian system that privileges a few powerful actors, mostly from the north, at the expense of long-term resilience, at the expense of long-term diversity in our sector, at the expense of truly long-term empowerment for actors across our system. And for me, the lesson here at Oxfam, but I hope for us as all as a sector, is to keep the best of our inheritance, but build on it to transform for the next era, for the next stage of our evolution. And so conversations like these and the amazing program that's been put together over the next 48 hours or so are a fantastic opportunity for us to dwell on what that progress should look like. And although the pandemic has wreaked havoc on all our lives, continues to wreak havoc, there is an upside to this conversation being virtual in that it connects a far more diverse set of actors. And so I genuinely hope this conversation helps us build a new humanitarianism for a new era, one that keeps people safe, one that shares power responsibility, one that celebrates diversity, one that draws on our respective strengths, one that's firmly focused on enhancing resilience, one that is firmly based on this notion of solidarity, of mutual liberation. Thank you very much for listening, and I wish you all the best for the next 48 hours. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. I would love to just repeat that quote one more time. If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I think that is a really great framing as we start this really intense 2 days of reflection and conversation. Danny, we'll definitely look forward to asking you more questions about your ideas. I see a lot of really good questions coming up through the Q&A or through the question box. So I'm looking forward to digging into that. And a reminder to participants, I see a lot of good activity happening there. So please feel free to keep asking questions and we'll get to those as soon as we can. After we end each session, the questions and answers can still keep coming and there are ways of interacting. So don't be shy about asking those questions. While you're asking your questions, I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge our conference sponsors and partners without whom this event would actually be completely impossible. CHL is a partnership between Deakin University and Save the Children Australia. Our key conference sponsors today include Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the IKEA Foundation. Additional conference supporters include Adeso, the Arab Institute for Women, Lebanese American University, and the Karam Foundation. The conference has also been sponsored by Asia Disaster Preparedness Center and the Asian Preparedness Partnership, which calls for multi-stakeholder collaboration to promote and strengthen the localization agenda and building disaster resilience. I'd also like to thank the following conference sponsors: Oxford HR, Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, Arogia Steva, and the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute. Thank you so much for all of your support. If any of our participants today would like to learn more about our sponsors, on the left side of your streaming platform, Delegate Connect, you'll see an icon which is correctly named Partners. If you navigate there and click around, you can learn about the partners, you can connect with them, you can even request a meeting or learn more about their team. So please feel free to poke around and see what you find there. And if you have any questions, please let us know. I'd also like to put one more plug in to remind you to harness the power of our social media networks and amplify this gathering by using the two hashtags, hashtag 2021HLC and hashtag Who Are the Humanitarians. Our fantastic comms team at the Center for Humanitarian Leadership will be looking out for ways to make this conference very loud in cyberspace. So thank you for your support with that. If you could take a moment as you're poking around on the platform, update your profiles to capture the power of this virtual event. We all know that this important type of gathering, when we can't do it in person, we're not going to pretend that something isn't lost. We all wish that we could be there in person, having those coffees and passing those business cards. But the next best thing is that you can poke around on the space, update your profile, make it public if you would like. You can go up to the top right of your screen and you can see where it says my profile or my account, and you can update everything there. What's really interesting is that you can do direct networking with other participants, speakers, or sponsors, and the social media links to each person's social media are directly linked inside there to make for really, really easy networking. And maybe we're saving additional carbon footprint by not passing out all those business cards that get smashed in the bottom of our bag. With that, I'm very, very excited now. We have just a handful of minutes, maybe 15, 20 minutes to do a quick round of questions with our panelists. A note to all of the participants and conference speakers, we have packed so much into this amazing 2 days. It's really difficult to keep people's attention for this many hours, but we have over 240 speakers, more than 50 sessions across all of these time zones. There will be people waking up at the crack of dawn and staying up until 3, 4 o'clock in the morning to make this happen. So thank you to all of the people who are participating on panels and preparing papers. It's really, really exciting. But we do have to end each session on time. So I'll sort of try and keep us moving here on the panel, get as many questions in as possible. And with that, we can go ahead and segue to our panel discussion. How are all of our panelists doing today? Welcome back, Iain. Welcome back, Degan. Welcome back, Danny. It's nice to see all of you. Maybe that's right, you guys are muted, I guess. I'll go ahead and maybe I'll start with a question for Iain. I think we've seen a lot of conversations sparked by the global Black Lives Matter movement, and they're occurring in places and institutions around the world. What leadership do you think the university sector can provide in supporting inclusion and diversity in academia and elsewhere?
You just said we didn't have a lot of time. 3 days later, we could still be talking about that. Look, I think there's the philosophical piece, which is universities having a role as being critic and conscience of society. And I think that is really important, where we can discuss the things that can't be discussed elsewhere. We can challenge people in a way that should be safe, but difficult, if that makes sense. So I think there's that high level, that's part of our core mission as a university. And then I think there is the broader leadership piece that we play, which is actually living it from day one, recognizing that everything we do needs to be focused on the lens of inclusion, making sure that we are not setting things up through acts of history, acts of background that disadvantage people from day one, but also modeling that leadership in what we do as well. It's not easy. It's always tricky. You will never quite get this right, but I think there is absolutely a role. And one of the delights for me about being in a university is we are an organization where you can do that. You are autonomous by definition, and that is really, really important.
I would agree with that. I think one of the joys I have from being a practitioner primarily over the last couple of decades and straddling this space between the humanitarian practitioner space and academia is I get to flex between both of those worlds. And I agree with you. I don't think that this type of conference could wrestle with these types of themes in a lot of places. And so we're really holding that identity today as being part of a university and celebrating the fact that we can have these really tough conversations. So thank you for that. I see a lot of questions coming up here on my phone and on the other side here. What I'd like to do is maybe shift a little bit to Degan and follow up on some of the questions that I think have been coming through. One thing that I'm really curious about, you've identified the need to reform the Bretton Woods institutions. And I've heard you talk a lot about the different problems with the existing high-level aid architecture. We can't really dismiss that these reforms just because they're difficult. And I love what you've talked about. Like, we can't just say it's too hard, let's try something else. Where would you suggest that we start? What personal or organizational actions can the participants here take if they want to further that agenda?
I think that's a really interesting question. I was in an event the other day with Danny, and he mentioned how the geopolitics of aid is not really talked about. But I remember during the World Humanitarian Summit, it was talked about by the Global South, civil society. We brought this up consistently. UN Security Council reform actually, I think, featured much more powerfully than localization, what later was called localization. We didn't call it localization, it was a term that was imposed on us. But it was completely disregarded. And it was sanitized from all the documents. Anytime we tried to talk about geopolitics, it was sanitized, it was removed. So I think, and now looking back on 2012, when we started the first consultations, or it was 2014, for the World Humanitarian Summit, did we expect that localization would feature so prominently in the conversations in the sector? Yes, change hasn't happened, that's for sure. It's been a failure. Localization has not happened. But what have we achieved? We achieved the fact that we could have this conversation. The target of 25% was achieved. And that target, no matter how much of a failure it has been, it has kept the donors at the table so that we continue this conversation, which is very important achievement. So my point in all of that is, did we think that we could have gotten all of this? No, when we started the WHS, we never even thought that we would get that far. So I think the first and foremost is to actually verbalize what it is that you want to change and have an open conversation, and let's not have this mindset, oh, it's too hard, or it's too controversial, or it's too political, it's a taboo subject, so let's not talk about racism. Racism was a taboo subject just only 2 years ago. I was blacklisted for calling it out, and now it's not a taboo subject. So I think we first need to verbalize it and actually start talking about these geopolitical issues and how they form the foundation of our complicity and an unjust system. And then I think next we can do things like Oxfam has been great at. Oxfam, I see Oxfam on the caliber of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International in holding the sector accountable for the 1%, the inequality reports, all of these things, fair trade. That was a big thing. So it's like, we need to verbalize it, but we also need to create a movement that talks about reparations and debt relief, that talks about UN Security Council reform, that talks about all of these issues. And we need INGOs to follow the footsteps of Oxfam and become even more radical and more in building that movement with INGOs, rather than being implementers and taking our space in our countries.
Great. And I also think it's really interesting, this idea that just the conversation about racism within this sector was truly taboo even just a couple of years ago. And I think what you've said about vocalizing where the problems are and pushing and keeping those discussions at the forefront rather than sweeping them under the rug and naming them something else. You talked earlier in your time about looking at the lexicon of humanitarianism. We have a lot of these harmful words, but we also have these kind of mushy words that no one really knows what they mean, and they get rebranded and repackaged so that we're not really talking about the issues. So I think that's a really important point. I'll shift now to Danny. There's a couple of questions that have come up in the feed, and I'm just going to suggest, let's talk about this one. You've rightly said that innovation is really important. Still, it's at such a nascent stage, especially in humanitarian and emergency response. Besides funding, what can be done to nurture innovation in these places?
Great, thanks, Mariana. First of all, I think we have to recognize that we're better than we sometimes give ourselves credit for. I think, what little experience I have of the sector at the sort of coalface is people and institutions with, within such huge constraints are doing amazing things. And that is the sort of innovation we need to sort of bottle and scale up, I think. So there is something we have to sort of give ourselves credit for. Funding is important, and creating the sort of resources to allow that innovation to nurture it is going to be really important. But I think it is important to go beyond funding, to think about, how do we get a more diverse group of people to come and solve problems together? And that's partly around diversity in terms of say, racial diversity that we've just been talking about, to make sure that the communities that we're in are active and co-creators of our solutions. But it's also diversity in terms of getting people from well outside our sector, beyond the usual suspects, to come together to crack some of these issues. And I remember Degan talked about the World Humanitarian Summit, and my two takeaways were, one, exactly the politics and the way that they evolved that Degan talked about, but the other was walking around in the sort of display area, where people had stalls, and looking at the 3D printing stall, where someone was showing the sort of, this is 5 years ago, early examples of how 3D printing was going to revolutionize our sector. Again, it hasn't quite worked to what we, to the extent we might think, but yet imagine how our sector would look if we didn't really have to ship things halfway around the world. If we could really, move quickly using local infrastructure, local actors. And that's a sort of innovation that I think we do need to invest in. So there's a lot there, but I think it's really about the resolve to say innovation isn't a sort of ornamental thing. It's a fundamental thing about how our system has been and needs to be.
Excellent. I actually think this is a good one to flick back over to Iain. There was a question that came up earlier about what role the academic or university sector could play in humanitarian response. And one thing that I've observed that gets me really, really excited sitting at a university that is known for innovation, frankly. Deakin has this rich resources from the Center for Supply Chain and Logistics and other places. Does anything about what Danny said resonate for you in terms of how the university sector could play a role in pushing forward this agenda of innovation?
Certainly for our university, and I think many, the sort of spirit of innovation, which is sort of, in my mind, the ability to put great ideas into practice to make a difference, is really important. So I think part of what we have to do is to find fora where those working at the humanitarian coalface can ask of academics to help them solve problems that they have. It's very hard from within the university to say, that's a problem we need to solve. So it's about how do we bring the right questions to the right people. So we've got great people in the university with solutions in search of a problem, and out there, problems in search of a solution. So it's how can we bring that together? And there are some great ideas. How do we do supply chain logistics better? I mean, 3D printing, yes, it's evolutionary, but there was one lovely thing I saw from Pacific Island where there was a pilot project of using recycled plastic to 3D print new water pipes. So the stuff that was washed up on a beach, that kind of lateral thinking is really where it's got to be. But again, it's how do we have the right forum where we can have questions and answers? And with all due respect to my life in universities, not going out from the university with a solution to a problem that is not the right problem.
Excellent. And I think, again, that's the joy for me of working at the Center for Humanitarian Leadership. It's this big idea of bringing together academic rigor, academic innovation, and humanitarian practitioners, and straddling those two worlds, which I think is sorely needed, and I think something we can tap into even more. We have let's say 2-3 minutes, and I'm going to throw a little bit of a tricky question to both Degan and Danny, and you guys can decide who answers it. There's a few questions coming up about safeguarding. And really the question is, how can the sector remove obstacles to reporting misconduct when those mechanisms are almost always internal, so that the organization or agency fundamentally ends up being only accountable to itself? So in 2 minutes, solve the problem of safeguarding.
Well, perhaps I'll begin. I think that question hits the nail on the head, because safeguarding failures are really about accountability failures, and they're about our system's collective failure, I think, to create safe spaces for people to report abuse of power. And we have been doing a lot internally, and a lot of our organizations are moving in the right direction, perhaps not quickly enough, but we are moving. But the next frontier clearly is about how we engage with communities. And, to me, the sort of saddest symbol of our collective failure is when you see those little suggestions and complaints boxes that sit in a refugee camp or in the corner of a community that just, in some ways represented what we thought was good enough when it comes to feedback and accountability. And it clearly isn't the case. There's some research some Oxfam colleagues have been doing around how to improve misconduct reporting from communities. I can share the link with you in a sec. And that's really, for me, revealing that to get that right, you have to start by putting communities and local voices first. And once you do that, then you can improve that environment and create the safe spaces for people to come forward. But more importantly, you reduce the risk of abuse happening in the first place, because you're walking together with the people that you are there to co-create with. And I think so the question, I think, is hits the nail exactly on the head.
Degan, in 1 minute, do you want to add anything?
I'm going to say something that many will not like, but my experience—
I love it.
My experience with safeguarding is that it's endemic in the sector. I'm sorry to say, at least what I have seen in Somalia, it's endemic with UN, many INGOs. It's not something isolated to Oxfam. And I personally am extremely disappointed that the conversation is only about one INGO and others thinking that they have, they've dodged a bullet and now they can continue a little bit business as usual. I actually think that in many ways, because we have been an Oxfam partner 20 years ago, we started being an Oxfam partner. And having experienced Oxfam and many other INGOs, I actually don't think Oxfam is one of the worst culprits of safeguarding. I think the UN is one of the worst culprits of safeguarding issues. But these are not discussed, again, because of the issue of power. And we know for a fact in the Mogadishu, in front of the airport where all the internationals sit, there's all these poor Somali women who are used and abused, and young girls every day as prostitutes in exchange for money because they are poor. It happens every single day in Somalia in front of the airport. Is there any accountability? No. All Somalis know it happens. Everybody knows it happens. But so I don't really think this issue of safeguarding is a really serious enough. I think what we need to start talking about is the dynamics of power that is involved when these expatriates come and save us and they come and work in our countries. And those dynamics, I think, are the foundational issues of safeguarding. I don't think you can talk about safeguarding without talking about the power dynamics that comes with internationals, experts, and expatriates coming into our countries.
That's exactly the type of tone we like to set as we end a panel. I like the juxtaposition of these two things. And Degan, I think bringing us right back to these issues of power, which is really the center of the entire conference theme. So with just a few seconds remaining, I'll thank you all for your time, and we'll see all of the participants in the next rooms around town, around our virtual town.